Great.
Well said.
And are there any other thoughts that you have, advice, suggestions, things that you think it's so important for people to keep in mind, or areas of growth, professional growth,
Yes.
that might be beneficial to people on IEP teams?
Well, Laurel, I'm glad you asked.
I knew you would.
have a few thoughts on the subject. The first is to keep in mind, and it's easy to forget for all of us, that all teaching and learning is cultural. So the way we do school, what we expect in a classroom, what an individual teacher expects in the classroom in terms of academic output, in terms of behavior, in terms of how students interact with one another, how they interact with the teacher, that's all culturally determined. So, so that means our perceptions of behavior and academic performance that seems to depart from those expectations is also cultural. And we need to keep that relative frame of reference. So when we're noticing quote-unquote misbehavior, or written academic products or spoken language that departs from what we expect in terms of what a book report is or what a persuasive essay is, let's start first with the curiosity of cultural perception and relativism. And let's pay attention to what are our own cultural expectations versus what might be an absolute standard for behavior or performance.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that educators who can cultivate some mindfulness
Yes.
about their own experiences, biases, and expectations, and then also be able to separate mindfully from those when they're engaging with students, particularly students who might be experiencing or bringing the richness of a different cultural or socioeconomic perspective to the classroom is so important.
Yes, absolutely.
That's great.
Absolutely. And just to put a finer point on this notion of our perception, that when there is a cultural disconnect between the experience of the teacher and the behavior of the student, and when there is really some dissonance between those, research teaches us that that disconnect can lead to poor self-concept, to discipline problems, and to poor academic outcomes. So those three things can, of course, masquerade as a learning disability, as an affective disconnect disorder, or just checking out from participating in the classroom experience because the students feel marginalized in that particular environment.
Right, and if I heard you correctly, you really are encouraging a response that embraces curiosity about
Yes.
that,
Yes.
questions rather than,
Yes.
the desire to seek adjustment or compliance first.
Correct.
Let's be curious about
Right.
these differences and engage in that process so that our students then and our families then can be engaged in that process.
Yes. Yes, to seek to understand before we seek to label and correct. And then along those lines, the notion of really appreciative inquiry, being asking students, right, in developmentally appropriate ways. So what's going on, and can you help me understand, right, as opposed to the stance and demeanor that might be correcting and scolding and disapproving, which typically doesn't encourage students to disclose really what's going on. So involving students, remembering to keep high standards, right? And I like to use the phrase, what's developmentally appropriate and appropriately rigorous, right? So let's marry the two of them, because either one without the other doesn't serve the learner and certainly will only frustrate the teacher. And finally, remembering universal design. right? What are all the different ways that we can ask students to, that new learning, new content, skills, and knowledge can be represented, different ways in which students can demonstrate their engagement and learning, and then assessment of what they've learned and how well they've learned it.
Yeah, and I like what you said too about the emphasis on rigor. I think sometimes people hear universal design for learning and they think, oh, we have to make it easier, we have to do something that is maybe not the same as what we were originally anticipating, but actually the level, if we can retain the level of rigor and students sense that,
Yes.
you know, then their sense of achievement and accomplishment can also be high.
Absolutely.
That's great.
Yeah.
Oh, what good
Perfect.
advice.
I'm glad to help.
So do you have any additional thoughts that you wanted to share, or are we ready to roll?
I think just the last thing, really to emphasize, and what I learned in my own experience, by what I did well, and by more often in those early years what I did less well, the mistakes that I made, is keeping in mind really the growth potential, the growth mindset. Focusing, and that's not just a cliche, but really focusing on improvement by helping students with specific and timely and really actionable feedback that shows them that you pay attention to their work, that you respect it enough to pay close attention in a timely manner, and to provide feedback that they can look at that and say, oh, I can do that, right? I know how to do that. And every time we give a student the experience of, I can do that, I know how to do the thing that originally they didn't know how to do, we are living with them, we are showing them the reality and the potential behind the growth mindset.
Yes, that's so important, and I agree with you that I think in IEP team meetings, if we can stay focused on that element of children with disabilities, or children who are struggling, who may not be disabled, but still have conversations that say, you know, this child has a lot of potential, and as a team, we are invested in that child's growth.
Yes.
And this is how. Here are the specifics. I agree with you. I think our IEP teams would be much more energizing places for all of us to be.
Excellent.
So, well, Albert, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it, and look forward to many more conversations like this.
My pleasure, and thank you to all of you for your efforts.
Mm.